So everyone, we are very, very lucky to have the wonderful Vaughn Bennison here this evening, who is the CEO of Disability Voices Tasmania. He brings a wide-ranging experience in management, policy, reform, and advocacy. His career ranges from a radio presenter to broadcast manager, specialist service provider, management and communications policy. He is a staunch advocate for the rights of disabled people, and as a blind person, brings a lifetime of lived experience to his work. He lives with his family in South Hobart, although he's in Canberra today, coming to us from a hotel room. If that's not commitment, folks, I don't know what is. And he is presenting on behalf of Disability Voices Tasmania, which is Tasmania's only cross-disability disabled people's organisation, or DPO. All members and staff are disabled people, and we advocate constantly for change that improves the safety, well-being, and lives of disabled Tasmanians. So thank you so much for being here today, Vaughn. And I'm going to stop sharing my slides and yeah, hand it over to you, and feel free to introduce yourself in the way that you would like as well.
Thank you, Rosie and Matt, and thanks everyone for having me. Most of you know who I am, I think, by now, but some of you don't. I'll go into my detail very briefly. I came down to Tasmania actually because the role of manager of Print Radio Tasmania came up in 2012 when the previous manager, who'd been there for 10 years, resigned, or retired rather, and I got the job, and after spending 15 years at home looking after, or 10 years at home looking after children, I walked into a management position, and I'd like to say I haven't looked back since, but sometimes I look back and think, if only I could be changing nappies again. I moved from there after 7.5 years to work for Visibility Tasmania, where I partially took over Rob's job, doing assistive technology assessment and training and provision and all of that sort of stuff, but also managing the therapy services team there. When they made me redundant in 2021, I moved over to the Australian Communications Consumer Action Network, where I was the Disability Policy Officer working on behalf of disabled people across Australia and working in the communications area. So looking at captioning, audio description on television, access to mobile phone providers and landline and internet, the digital economy, all of that sort of stuff from the perspective of disabled people. When the opportunity came up to apply for the role of executive officer at that time of DVT, I really felt that I needed to. Thank you, James. I think it's 4 actually. Yeah, sorry. I thought I had to apply for that and take the next step in my career, and I got the job, and I've been the CEO now of DVT for about 2.5 years. So what is actually nearly 3 years? Everything's going off today. It's unbelievable. By the way, I should mention that yes, I am in a hotel room in Canberra, and if people wander in, my room wasn't actually clean today, and they didn't bring me coffee, and I've expressed my dissatisfaction with that. So they may rock up with some coffee and other things for me. So if people wander in, you'll know why. And I'm here because, as well as being the CEO of DVT, I'm the president of Blind Citizens Australia, and I'm also on the Independent Advisory Council to the National Disability Insurance Agency. So I'm actually up here in Canberra, among other things, doing the IAC meeting. So what is Disability Voices Tasmania? It's not a choir, and DVT does not stand for deep vein thrombosis. Disability Voices Tasmania started as a pilot project which was funded by the state government and managed, I understand, through Anglicare and run by a steering committee. And we have at least one of the members of that steering committee here with us today. Disability Voices Tasmania was originally established to determine whether there was a need and a desire for a disabled people's organisation in Tasmania, a key, a cross disability disabled people's organisation? The answer to that question was a resounding yes, and it was very clearly demonstrated that there was a need, there was capacity, and there was a desire for that to happen, but the state government didn't come through with any further funding to continue that project. So it sort of fell into abeyance for a while, and once it got revived through the work of a number of people, again, some of which are here tonight, it was able to get funding from the Department of Social Services, originally through the NDIA, through the ILC, Information Linkage and Capacity Building Framework. We've had funding through the ILC in one way or another now since early 2020, and you are the first people to know. I'm sure Elise wouldn't mind me passing this on, but we have been told that we will be getting an extension until June next year. We have a board of 7 members, all of whom, as Rosie said, are disabled people. In fact, our constitution mandates that all members of the organisation must be disabled people. They must live in Tasmania, and they must support the principles and the philosophies of Disability Voices Tasmania. As the CEO, my undertaking or my commitment is that anybody who is employed by DVT will be a disabled person. That's a commitment that I make because I recognise very strongly, after years and years of trying to apply for work and not being successful, that getting a job as a disabled person in Australia is really difficult, and even in Tasmania it's particularly difficult. So what does Disability Voices Tasmania do? We advocate on behalf of all disabled people in Tasmania, and we do so through collaborative efforts, and we're going to talk more about those as the presentation continues. But our real goal is to amplify the voices of disabled people in Tasmania, to strive for equity and equality, to strive for the empowerment of disabled people, and to strive for a Tasmania where disability is not a barrier to participation in any form. That's our overall goal, and to do that we do a number of things. Firstly, what we're funded for. We're funded under the ILC currently for project work. And most of you know that funded projects are not really where it's at, and they're not really what is needed. But I just want to go through some of the projects that you may have heard of or may have been a part of in the past. One of our most famous projects is Broadcast Your Voice, where we taught a number of disabled people how to build podcasts and how to get their voices heard on community radio. That was one of the first projects we did once we got the ILC funding back in 2020, and we ran it in Hobart, and then we ran it again in 2022-23 in Launceston. It was quite successful. I think altogether we had about 16 people go through the program. There has been a desire to reopen that gate and to start doing some more work in terms of disability media and disability radio. But it's certainly coming from a background of broadcasting for 30 years now. It's certainly a desire of mine. As well as Broadcast Your Voice, we've done a Change Matters program, and we've done 2 guises of that. It was originally called Pitch Perfect, and it was teaching people or capacity building people about how to use their stories to create change. We rebadged it when we ran it again last year and called it Change Matters, because change really does matter, and it is extremely important, particularly as we enter this massive period of reform. We've run projects on inclusive and accessible tourism very successfully. We've run projects on emergency planning, which have led to some much more significant work being undertaken by the Department of Police, Fire and Emergency Management. Unfortunately, that lost me one of my staff last year, but he's doing great things over there at with emergency planning for disabled people. And that's looking at what happens when disabled people are met by crisis or emergency situations. What's the shelter situation if they have to evacuate? What is their mechanism for evacuating? Have people developed their own emergency plans and all of that sort of stuff? As well as doing that, whilst we're not funded for it, we undertake a number of systemic advocacy tasks. And I want to be clear that systemic advocacy is not talking about such and such a person didn't get the NDIS plan, so can you help? Systemic advocacy is advocating for broad sweeping change that affects either significant portions or all of the Tasmanian community. Many of you have been involved in our systemic advocacy efforts, and James, I'm looking at you, particularly in regard to our work with e-scooters, because the thoughts and the things that you've put forward to us in different meetings have formed our policy and our ongoing advocacy around the use of e-scooters, particularly in Hobart and Launceston. Not sure what's happening in Burnie with e-scooters, but we can get into that later. One of our early systemic advocacy efforts was about the Religious Discrimination Bill, which was put forward initially by the coalition government some years ago, which effectively allowed people to get away with things on the basis of their religion. And that meant that not only could potentially people use religious reasons to get out of taking, for example, people with guide dogs, but they could get away with saying discriminatory, hurtful, or bullying things about disabled people simply because that is their religious view, and the bill protected them from criminal prosecution on that basis. We were quite prominently against this bill, and the bill very quickly got scrapped. I'm hoping that such appalling and ridiculous legislation will never come up again in this country. We know what's happening with the US in particular at the moment, and I really don't want to see Australia go down that track. We've also done systemic advocacy on accessible housing, making sure that people have access to appropriate accessible housing, that the government recognises that disabled people need to live somewhere too. They don't all live in group homes and sheltered workshops and things, and they have every right to live in whatever house they choose. We've advocated on issues around COVID-19, particularly around the wearing of masks and other personal protective equipment, and recognising disabled people as more likely to have immune compromised conditions, and that things needed to be put in place to protect those people. And more recently, one of the key things that we're really proud of is our work on the Disability Rights, Inclusion and Safeguarding Bill, and we'll get into that very shortly. We regularly advocate on issues like accessible transport, that's including taxis, wheelchair taxis in particular, buses, and we try to get people on access advisory committees. Indeed, one of the key things that we're working towards at the moment is to encourage more local councils to have advisory committees. I understand that there are 4 councils across Tasmania that actually have access advisory committees. So we're going to talk a little bit about today, what does a reformed Tasmania look like? How do we get there? Who is responsible? And how will we know when we're there? I'm sure that we all know a lot of the answers to these, but I want to talk a little bit about my view for an accessible and inclusive reformed Tasmania. Tasmania is one of the last states to do anything about equity and inclusion for LGBTIQ+ people. Tasmania, interestingly, was one of the first states in Australia to legislate for guide dogs, to allow guide dogs. And to date, it still has the most robust penalties if guide dogs are refused access to a venue or to a taxi or an Uber or some form of transport. And just to put you in the picture, that fine, if the person concerned complains and the complaint is upheld, that fine is around $4,500. The Transport Department has its own set of fines, and that takes investigation by the Transport Department. In many respects, it's much easier to access, but again, you still have to prove it. So again, we've got this issue of being complaints-based. Tasmania last year adopted the, it's just gone out of my head, the Disability Rights, Inclusion and Safeguarding Bill. It is the first piece of legislation in Australia, and still the only piece of legislation in Australia, to acknowledge disability rights in its title. And much of that was through the work of Disability Voices Tasmania. But much of that work on behalf of DVT was done by the people who are responsible for making change, and that is the community. But when we think about a reform Tasmania, we need to think about all of the reform agenda that's currently underway. And that is underpinned by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. I really wish they changed the title. The UNCRPD, as I shall hitherto refer to it, is now borne out through Australia's disability strategy. And in Tasmania, we have Tasmania's disability strategy, which hasn't yet been fully adopted, but was out for consultation earlier this year. The idea behind these strategies is to make the country, and Tasmania in this instance, a much more accessible and equitable place. In other words, looking at reform. That is the key piece of reform at the moment that is governing the Tasmanian landscape. To my mind, it's already out of date because it doesn't take into account, or at least it didn't in the consultation draft that was put out earlier this year, it doesn't take into account the passing of the Disability Rights Act, as I continually refer to it as. It doesn't take into account the establishment of the Tasmania's Disability Commissioner, and it doesn't take into account, in my view, a holistic, all-of-government approach to equity and inclusion and true across-the-board reform. And I'll give you an example, a couple of examples of what I mean. One of the key things is talking about accessible communication, but the only department that has committed to doing that is the Department of Police, Fire and Emergency Management. Wouldn't you think that in the interests of proper and sensible reform and efficiency, that all of government would be expected to make their communications accessible? That all of the government would be expected to undertake all of the actions in Tasmania's disability strategy. And I'm sure that the consultation draft is still publicly available if you'd like to have a look at it. And you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. There are some examples where the Education Department is responsible for making sure all of its websites are up to date and comply with WCGA 2.2, I think they said. Why are all government departments not expected to do that? Why is this an Education Department responsibility only? So a true reform Tasmania to me is one where all levels of government, including local government, understand and accept the equity and the right of disabled people to live as equal citizens in Tasmania. A truly reformed Tasmania is one where somebody can walk out their door and walk half an hour to work without having to be clobbered by an e-scooter. A reformed Tasmania is one where somebody who chooses not to go for a walk with their guide dog but chooses to get a taxi can do so without the added anxiety of thinking, oh shit, will they pick me up today? How long will I have to wait? A reformed Tasmania is one where an autistic person can apply for a job and be considered on an equal basis with everybody else. So how do we get there? I don't think anybody really has the answer to that question. But I think we do have some ideas and some suggestions. One of the ways that we can make that happen is by making sure that the government is very well aware of where their efforts are lacking. That doesn't necessarily mean writing to them every week, although that might be a strategy that works for some and in some instances. But it's about having open and frank discussions. But it's also about having open and frank discussions about what will happen if these things aren't attended to. And it's about having an ability and a lack of fear about making sure that the community, and I don't just mean the disability community, I mean the entire Tasmanian community, is aware of where we are lacking in terms of disability access and disability equity. And that is one of the things that DVT does really well. For a relatively small organisation, and when I say small organisation, as I said, I'm the only staff member, and we have 7 board members, and we have a few people now who have joined some of our subcommittees. We have a huge amount of experience and a huge amount of expertise in our organisation, and sometimes I sort of look at the work that we've done, and it's not all about me because much of it happened before I came on board. But I look at some of the work we've done and I think, I look at some of the other state-based organisations and I think, you guys can only dream about some of the reforms that we've made happen in the last 5 years. And I think that's one of the aspects that makes Tasmania really unique. We have a relatively small organisation and we're getting bigger all the time because we're getting more and more members. And in fact, many of you here tonight are members. But we have the potential to make change in Tasmania on a scale that is not possible anywhere else in the country. And the reason for that is because Tasmania is a small state, and the Tasmanian government in particular realizes or doesn't necessarily know where it's failing its citizens, but it knows that it is. And we have a situation where we have a microcosm of expertise from disabled people and allies who are not afraid to stand up and shout to the rooftops and be counted when it's needed. So who's responsible for making Tasmania an equitable and inclusive state? We all are. Every person here, every person in the state is responsible for equity, inclusion, safeguarding, and most of all, the protection of the human rights of disabled people. But back to the question of how do we do that? There's no one strategy, in my view, that is going to work. There's a lot of things that DVT can do, but we don't have massive amounts of capacity. We will continue to fight the main areas where fighting is required, but we can't tackle every battle, particularly at the moment where we're not funded to do that systemic advocacy work. So one of our key goals for now is trying to make sure that we get some funding from the state government to perform that systemic advocacy body of work. That we're able to get out into the community and talk to people and find out what their issues are, and that we're able to bring and distill those issues into something that is meaningful and useful to feed back into policy development and strategic development for not only DVT and for the disability community, but for the state government. I've always been very apolitical, and I my argument is for not taking sides is that I piss them all off equally. So I don't particularly want to take sides. What I will say though, and I will commend the current government, and you won't hear this very often, not from me, but I will commend the current government for its willingness to engage with the disability community. And we don't necessarily get everything we want, but they do hear us. And one of the things that I haven't mentioned, but is very hot off the press, and some of you may already know about it, but we recently had a significant advocacy win. We now have telephone voting available for people with a print disability in Tasmania. And that's not only thanks to the work of DVT, it's thanks to a group of people who worked together and put together a working group and an argument to compel the Tasmanian Electoral Commission to make change. And we thought we weren't going to get there. Anyone who's on that group will tell you that we thought we weren't going to get there because the Commission dug its heels in and pushed back pretty hard. And so we decided that this wasn't working and we would go directly to the top. So we did. We wrote to the Premier, we wrote to the Attorney General, and we wrote to the Disability Minister. And I and Blind Citizens Australia's Policy and Advocacy Officer met with the Attorney General. And actually, I think Duncan from the Tasmanian branch was a part of that meeting as well. We met with the Attorney General and we explained why telephone voting was so important, why it was appropriate for disabled people to be able to exercise their right to vote, and what it meant that people were being excluded from being able to exercise that obligation. Effectively, it meant that anybody who chose not to have a sighted person go in and help them broke the law. And I pointed out quite strongly at that meeting that by not making these changes, the Tasmanian government was aiding and abetting law breaking. That's a pretty big thing to say, but it's absolutely true, and it got change. So we've got an upcoming election on Saturday for the Legislative Council in 3 areas, 3 electorates. Nelson is one of them. I can never remember the others, but if there's anybody here who is part of those electorates, I would encourage you to use that telephone voting if it's appropriate for you. It's now available, and it will be available in any state government election or any election that is covered under the Tasmanian Electoral Commission, not local government at the moment, but certainly the state government elections. So we're working still on local government, and we are really, really hopeful that we will have an equitable and accessible voting process for the Local Government Act very shortly. There was a discussion paper put out earlier this year to which Disability Voices Tasmania submitted on behalf of our organisation, also a number of other organisations, including Blind Citizens Australia's Tasmania branch, and COTA, Council on the Ageing, and a few others. But we haven't heard the results yet. I should note that one of the things that DVT doesn't do is it doesn't speak for organisations. We will happily do the work assisted by those other organisations. And we invite other organisations to sign on to the advocacy work that we do. We don't see ourselves as speaking for or on behalf of anybody. We see ourselves as being a vehicle through which the views of the community can be heard. So we do a lot of our work, our policy work and our submission work, through collaboration. And we will continue to do that with other organisations and individuals, because it's through that community outreach and that community connectivity that we can really make change. DVT can't possibly reflect all disability groups. We have a number of board members, for example, who are wheelchair users. We have a board member who has a hearing and vision impairment. I'm blind. And we have somebody who has a brain injury. So we do cover some disabilities, but we can't possibly cover all disability groups. And even when you look beyond specific disability groups, everybody's experience is unique. So my experience, for example, as a blind person is not the same as Doug's experience as a blind person, or Rob's experience as a blind person, or James's, come to that. So it's really important to us that we hear from as many people as we can. And by growing our member base is one way of achieving that. So if we want to see the reform agenda improve in Tasmania, one of the best ways that every person in this community can do that is to be a part of DVT and to feed into our consulting work, our policy writing, and the advocacy work that we do. How will we know when we get to a fully reformed Tasmania? Well, I don't think we ever will. And the reason for that is that there's always somewhere to go, right? It's about continuous improvement. And anyone who's into governance and, a bit of a governance nerd will know about continuous improvement. You always try to do better for your community and for your organization. But there are some indicators that I will be looking for over the coming years that will tell me if the reform that we've been striving for and the reform that the government has agreed to and that the government is working towards is working. One of those ways is when we start to see fewer discriminatory practices happening, such as, for example, the requirement for a driver's license when applying for a job. When we see more disabled people in front-facing roles, public-facing roles, whether that is through the NDIA or other organisations, or whether it is through big business, for example, as cashiers or as frontline staff in communications offices or medical centres or whatever, we will know that we're getting to a reformed Tasmania when disabled people stop ringing with complaints, not because they're sick of complaining about the same thing again and again, but because those problems have been rectified. And we will know that we have a reformed Tasmania when people don't have to hide the fact that they are disabled. When I have a discussion with the disability minister about how many disabled people work in her department, and she can tell me the answer because everybody who is disabled sticks up their hand and says, I'm proud of who I am. I live in Tasmania and we are the greatest state in the country. And I am proud to be disabled in Tasmania. I think that's probably all I've really got to say, but I do want to acknowledge the fact that Elise Gavlik, our chair, DVT's chair, is in the room as well. And I'd also like to once again thank Rosie and Matt for having me, and to all of you for listening to this presentation, and I'm more than happy to take some questions, whatever you think appropriate.
Rosie speaking. There's some cheers in the room that you're not able to hear. And I was definitely getting a little bit teary at the end there when you were talking about, being proud to be disabled in Tasmania. And yeah, I really hope that we can get to that point, and that makes me a little bit emotional to think about. We do have a hand up from James. I just wanted to check with Elise. Did you have anything you wanted to add before we go to questions?
Thanks, Rosie. It's Elise here. Look, I don't think I could have put it better, Vaughn. I think Disability Voices is not the only organisation representing disability in Tasmania, but I think we're one of the organisations that works well with our partners, and I think that's a great strength that Vaughn has brought to the organisation. We will partner with any organisation that assists us and them to reach the goal of equity in Tasmania. So thanks Vaughn for giving that talk. some of those things I also feel very passionate about on a personal level, and I too was feeling quite proud and of our work. So again, thank you for the opportunity to present some of DVT's work to you.
Have to leave it at that, but thank you so much, everyone. It's been a beautiful evening and such a great discussion. Like I said, next one is the 3rd week of June. It will be completely virtual, and it will be Doug and Amelia speaking. So come along to support them and talk about using a computer without a mouse.